Well, hello, everyone. I'd like to bid all of you welcome to day, whether you're on the East Coast, whether you're in Europe, as we have some attendees. We have several from Australia and the West Coast. Great representation, and really welcome you to the August edition of the Grasp Technologies 2021 webinar series. Today, we are talking about an interesting topic, as I'm sure travel managers and travel professionals across the world are really starting to see this, that your businesses are starting to travel again. So that's a good thing, right? It's kind of a yay, but then you're sitting there saying, okay, now what? What do I do? How do I protect my people? How do I inform my people? Or even if you're traveling recreationally. What does that look like as travel returns, but also as the variant is spiking in many parts of the world? So interesting topic. I am so happy to have three very esteemed panelists joining me. My name is Rick George. I am Senior Vice President of Enterprise Sales for Grasp. And before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping items, please. First of all, if all of you would remain on mute until the question and answer portion of our session today, and we will allow certainly time for Q&A. Also, you can type in questions into the question box, the chat box, and my colleague Peter will be fielding those. This session is being recorded, and you may request a copy if you would like of the recording by emailing your address into the question box, and Peter and I will make sure that you receive a copy. And then if you would like follow-up from us, from Grasp on today's session, you can do one of two things. Either you can email me at rick@grasptech.com or sales@grasptech.com. So without further ado, I would like to introduce, in no particular order, three very esteemed men who are in our travel industry. First of all, Andy Menkes. Andy is founder and CEO of Partnership Travel Consulting. Robert McCoy, who is Global Travel Manager at Perkins Coie. And Michael Hall, who is Senior Manager of Global Travel at Illumina. And just from a full disclosure standpoint, Mike and Illumina is a current Grasp client. Robert and Perkins Coie is not currently a Grasp client, and Andy, obviously being a consultant, he represents his clients and is agnostic in that realm. So, gentlemen, thank you all for joining very much, and we look forward to a really good discussion. You know, it was interesting. Some of you may have seen my LinkedIn page from a couple of weeks ago. I took my first business trip since November of 2019. 2 weeks ago, traveled to Boston. That was an interesting experience in many ways, to say the least. Great airline, great hotel, great experience. But obviously with the masks, with concern in the airports and everything, it was an interesting experience for me. And so I'd like to open this up and ask each of you, have you traveled in the last 12 months for business or personally? And just what were a couple of takeaways that each of you had? And maybe I'll start with Andy, if I could, please.
Happy to do that, Rick. I did check. I keep a file of my trips, and year to date, I've flown 32 segments. Wow. Which mathematically in 2019 I flew 120. So I'm down from that, but need to point out that of the 39 segments, basically averaging 2 segments per trip, only 2 were business trips. One very recently was to an industry M&E conference. There were 800 attendees. And the other one was our first in-person TMC best and final presentation that we've done in 2 years. All the others have had to be remote. The short answer on the experience is travel. I hope there's not too many airlines on here. Travel is never fun to begin with. The further up the plane you sit, the more fun it could become. The higher your status, the less stress. So I would say I had really no safety concerns per se, partially because I had my vaccinations early on. And also, I always wear a mask when I'm out. And last but not least, I keep my distance no matter what. So I would say that we will see an upswing in business travel with certain conditions and precautions. but it'll take a while to get back to 2019 levels.
Thanks, Andy. Michael, what has been your experience in the past 16, 18 months?
So I haven't traveled for business in the last year and a half. I have traveled for vacation in the last couple of months. I found it more stressful than usual. I will tell you that my wife's family had a family reunion in Wisconsin last week. Every single person traveling in had a late schedule change. In one case, not communicated correctly. The other thing I've noticed is I had to travel to Montana. I had to book my rental car 3 months out, and I had to change the city that I was flying into in order to get a rental car. So a lot of differences like that. I also, in the middle of Montana, I had to pay like $400 a night for one of my hotels. So huge volatility and availability. Yeah, like I say, more stressful. I think that's just from people not being very happy about sort of being prodded into a long tube and told to keep something with their mouth. Anyway, so find it more stressful, but yeah, it's happening, and planes are fuller right now, so maybe that's a good thing.
Absolutely. And Robert, how about you down in Florida?
I've been on about 5 trips so far in the past 3 months, actually. Twice to Atlanta and a couple times to Washington, D.C., and really didn't notice, a great deal of any major issues traveling, other than, like Andy had said, last-minute schedule changes, were popping up. All of the flights that I took did have either cancellations or late hour, sort of 10, 15 minute prior to departure schedule changes. Other than that, the interesting thing is every flight I've been on has been only half full. So I was fortunate, maybe it's because of the routing, time of day travel. I'm not sure if people want to take a 5:50 a.m. flight out of Jacksonville, but they're typically not that full. So, but overall, very good experience. Airport, doesn't seem to be too full. Washington, D.C., I flew in a couple times into D.C. National, and the return flights, the airports were very full. TSA PreCheck was backed up more than usual than I've seen in the past, and only because I think that there were fewer lines open to filter people through.
Interesting. Yeah, it's very consistent with what we're hearing from our customers and the prospects that we're talking to, and we are starting to travel. Our CEO Eric is pledged to take at least 1 trip a month now to support the airlines and support the hotels. So he's starting to travel quite a bit. Andy. So a question to you is the consulting expert on our panel. Over these past 16 months or so, all travel has been very diminished. Are you seeing more of a need for your services, or are they kind of maintained? Are people planning for the future, or are people kind of holding tight? What's been your observation so far?
Sure, Rick. Well, I'd hope there's always a need for our services no matter what. But I would say as a result of the impact of COVID-19 on the business travel side of the industry, 2 phenomena have come up that's affecting our business in terms of new interest. One is where a TMC goes to the client, and we've got 2 buyers here, and says, well, as a result of COVID-19, we've lost a lot of money on your account because you're on a transaction fee. Your transactions are down 90%. My revenue is down 90%. So I want to switch you to a new model, and that model is either a subscription fee or some type of management fee. That's resulted in procurement and sourcing saying, well, we're going to consider making a change to the agreement. Let's see what else is out there. So there's a renewed interest in taking business out for bid where there's been pressure or communication from the TMC saying, I would like to change our existing agreement. Mm-hmm. The additional piece is typically when it's time to go out for bid on a cycle of 5, 7, 8 years, whatever. One of the concerns has always been there's never a good time to change TMCs if we're going to end up changing TMCs. So it typically cycles towards the 4th quarter when travel is slowest. So the additional impact that we've seen is a renewed interest in accelerating bids because the contract, let's say, is overripe in terms of the number of years it's been on the vine, with companies feeling, well, if we are going to make a change, the best time to do it is when 80% of our travel is not traveling. So it's those two.
Yeah, we're seeing very much the same thing, and we're starting to see as well. And I'd be interested, Robert and Mike specifically, as to some new areas within global corporations becoming much more involved, such as human resources, from a duty of care perspective. Everything that human resources, performs is a function. And I'm curious from a Lumina standpoint and Perkins Coie, are you seeing that as well? And to what level, and specifically in what ways, are you finding human resources being either involved in discussions with you, maybe discussions with current or future vendors? Mike, can we start with you?
Sure. Thanks, Rick. Yeah, I would say, first of all, January of 2020, we started to have daily meetings with HR and with our environmental health and safety, and we still have those meetings happening twice a week. And we have not suspended those meetings. They're still happening, and they are going over not only our situations worldwide, but also our how we change travel as a result of that. So all of those teams, EHS, including security, HR, and travel, have been involved in those decisions. HR has been very involved in helping us to define what's critical travel, what's essential travel, who should be approving at that level. Policies like approving non-stop travel only where it was available, that was something that I put to HR, and they were very much in favor of that. Other policies, for example, we increased our use of Airbnb in situations where people couldn't get to restaurants. They wanted to use an Airbnb. Again, HR was involved in that kind of thing. So we've always had that level of involvement. We've always also had, there have been some, I wouldn't say mental health issues, but there have been concerns about the mental health of people who had to travel, because we have had to have essential travel going on. Again, HR very involved in monitoring those situations and very sensitive to that, like the potential for that occurring. We also have had people who have actually become infected while on the road, and again, HR very involved in those situations. So yeah, it's been a very good partnership, and I've gotten to know my HR representative a whole lot better in the last few months, I'll tell you that. Yeah.
And Robert, how about you?
I think that the firm put a COVID response team in place at the very beginning of the pandemic, February timeframe of last year, and they've maintained, fairly, structured, health, safety, and wellness guidelines. HR is involved in a portion of that, specifically related to the health and wellness issue. And then there's a duty of care team that manages, COVID-specific responses, whether it be across, office reopenings, access to offices, customer offices, as well as the travel program. We still have a limited travel program open, because in the nature of what the firm does, the legal process doesn't necessarily come to a stop, so there is some travel that's taking place. But I think overall in the travel program side of it, it's been traditionally a very decentralized program, and I think that through the pandemic, it's focused on re-centralizing some of the travel resources, suppliers, networks, and accessibility, by members, both staff, contract workers, consultants, and partners.
You both mentioned an interesting word, and maybe we can expand on it a little bit more and get Andy's opinion as well. The critical travel need. When travel is deemed necessary. Who's determining that within your organizations? Andy, what are you seeing from the companies that you consult with? Is it Is it human resources? If it's a very sales forward organization, is it an EVP or SVP of sales? Or in one of our companies, one of our largest corporate clients, it's actually the CEO who is basically, saying if travel will happen or travel will not from a duty of care perspective. So Andy, maybe we could just start with you, and then Michael, and then Robert.
Thanks, Rick. Trying not to generalize, but given no choice, most of that decision is from the C-level. And I'm sure it's in consultation with HR, legal, finance, etc., mostly about the duty of care, the safety and health of employees. So the definition of mission critical depends on who's defining it. If it's the senior head of sales, then an in-person best and final would be considered mission critical. It's not. Okay, that's sales critical. That's revenue critical. Not the same thing. So we've got clients that are in the medical devices industry, and if an MRI machine is broken, they need to send a tech out to fix it. That's considered mission critical. So I would say it's typically defined as to the company's urgent operating needs or to the client's urgent operating needs, not the financial impact to the revenue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Mike, what are you seeing with Illumina?
Yeah, it's funny that that Andy mentioned the medical instruments, because that's exactly the business that we're in. In fact, we're in the business of medical instruments that sequence RNA, specifically of viruses, among other things. So that means that we have to go and install these machines all over the world. That becomes mission critical, especially when we are, in many cases, helping organizations be able to tackle the COVID pandemic, sometimes in developing countries. So those things have been seen as mission critical, but they've been seen as that by, again, C-level. Our SVPs had to approve all travel, and it had to be critical during the height of the worst of the pandemic. And that changed from region to region. So you might have a region, say, like Asia Pacific, that was only, VP had to approve. Yet you'd find, say, Europe and North America or South America, where it had to be an SVP approval. And very often that was on a project level too. So that's where the approvals were. The CEO was kept very involved. HR tended to be the liaison. They weren't making the decisions, but they would liaise and say, look, this is the medical risk, this is the operational risk, and they could sort of bring those together and present their case to SVP or CEO, whatever. Yeah.
And Robert, how about for you?
Well, prior to the beginning of June, the travel policy had some restrictions, based on what travel need was, and the practice groups, essentially, which are C-levels, made the determination, for travel. Post June, the travel policy is, I don't want to say it's more liberal, but it's opened up to a much broader, section of either, contract worker or staff or partner who is able to travel, but based on a criteria that they need to meet in order to qualify for travel. The one critical thing that we have to take into consideration is the majority of our travel is client-facing or court-facing, so they have to follow the guidance and guidelines, not only of the firm, but also the client that they're visiting, or possibly even the court that they're visiting. So it's sort of a three-pronged, strategy as far as making a determination of what is considered to be critical or non-critical travel. We expect that will, stay in place for the time being until there's a wider reopening, nationally and internationally. We are seeing a very, very small amounts of international travel resume, but it's also based on a critical need, for that travel.
It's interesting because I think probably everyone on this call, or a large portion of received emails in 2020 from Global Business Travel Association, and in terms of just kind of testing the waters in terms of the corporate feel for where the pandemic was at various stages. You're more likely to travel sooner rather than later, that type of thing. And I'm curious for Robert and Mike, what type of employee testing, not COVID testing, but through temperature checks and in email concerns, likeliness, wanting to return to travel has been done. Has it been done through surveys? Have you had town halls within the company? What was happening in 2020, and has that changed? As now we're into August of 2021. Mike, let's start with you.
Sure. So as we allow travelers back onto the road, we are stipulating, although we can't enforce this right now, but we are stipulating that travelers should be vaccinated travelers. And we are in policy saying if they're not vaccinated, they need to discuss the criticality of their mission with their management line. But a year ago, I would say that one of the things we were looking at most closely in terms of that was not so much who the travelers were as painting a picture for the traveler as how safe that situation was. And this could vary from city to city. You might get Houston, Texas at one point last year had like 95% ICU beds full. We were getting that intelligence twice weekly, publishing it. And if we had a situation like that, getting in front of the traveler and saying, why don't you postpone this a few weeks? So I think that was helping to alleviate some of the concerns that the traveler had. They were far more aware. We were getting intelligence to make them more aware of the environment they were going into. We were hand-holding travelers to a far greater extent. In some cases, overdoing it. So far more involved in discussions about where they were going, what had changed, what the hotel was like, all of those things, which would normally be handled on a totally automated level. So I think that was helping the traveler. We did have a lot of, people managing those travelers who were very involved in talking to them, making sure that their mental health was taken care of. So yeah, I think we did a very good job of sort of ensuring the travelers were taken care of. Yeah.
And Robert, what about for you?
So we have some standards, set in place. Again, it goes back to what the requirements of either, a jurisdiction is for a particular court or the requirements of a client. But we do have testing standards in place, both for pre and post travel to, trips that took place during COVID. We partnered with the National Laboratory in order to provide more rapid, testing results. And they put policies in place in order to assist employees who did become infected, with COVID while traveling, in company business. But I think, again, moving forward, that, the policies are going to sort of stay in line with, what the CDC guidance is going to be. We really, and seeing all the revisions of policies come through, not only for the, for the firm here, but, in general research, especially what the GBTA has been doing, you're seeing very similar sort of, positions by other, medium-sized and larger, employers that are looking for, policy guidance related to COVID. At some point, it's going to, there'll be, sort of a reopening of that. Vaccination status, we have wellness checks that we do, for people who do go into facilities, into, one of the offices, as well as, some of the remote hybrid workforce that's out there as well. So,
and so
we don't survey, people on there. We know that everyone wants to travel.
And so a lot of times, guys, the old adage is, hindsight's 20/20. You look back and you look at your program, maybe the consulting relationships, Andy, that you've had with your clients before COVID. So let's dial back to, I don't know, let's say February of 2020, when, or maybe even March, when it seemed to really start to shut down in a lot of areas of the world. Having had time to reflect on this, and the questions, please, to all three of you, what would you have done differently to maybe prepare. Nobody could prepare, obviously, for what has happened, but many of us went through SARS, many of us went through 9/11, which was a completely different situation for sure, but it hugely affected travel for many months. So with your programs in specific, and Andy, as you're consulting with your clients, if you could have done something maybe a little bit differently, or maybe something that you're putting in place for the future, what one or two things would that be? And Robert, we'll start with you if we could, please.
Sure. I think that I'm new to the program that I'm running right now. So, but in speaking for other programs that I've been involved in, I think that having being more face front in the discussion with the airlines would have been more beneficial. I think the airlines took a long time in making decisions on what they were going to do with these very large banks of unused tickets that they were faced with, and there were no previous policies in place for that. I think moving forward, I think that that's where either the TMC's relationship or the contract owner's relationship with the airlines and the hotel providers and other partners in their travel program will change a little bit, is by putting stopgaps in place for future issues like this, specifically to pandemics. I also think that it sort of forced us into the reality that the travel policies might not have been as strong as they could have been. And I think that I would have gone back much earlier in the process to revisit travel policy parameters and standards and try to centralize more of that up front at the beginning of a pandemic or beginning of a large event like this, versus trying to figure it out later. The pandemic changed dramatically on a week-to-week basis for many months. So I think that any policy that had been put in place might have been revised during that period, but I think that there should have been some stopgaps, sort of in place in order to protect not only the suppliers but also the company and the contracts from further dilution or cancellations or any other type of rollover that's in effect. I would have gone back and renegotiated airline contracts much closer to the shutdown of the pandemic versus later on, like they're doing right now.
And Andy, how about for you and your clients?
Well, when I first heard your question, my thought was, if I can go back in time to 2019, I would have booked my bucket list vacation. We would have done that African safari that we've been talking about for 2 decades. But tying it to the business side, by coincidence or otherwise, our company was founded in 2001 in January, and I decided then I'm going to do a PTC conference in November. That turned out to be 2 months after 9/11. Not the best time to hold a boondoggle in wine country. So we had events planned for this year, and I naively moved them slightly. If I could have known the impact of that moving target, I would have pushed them out by at least half a year instead of a few months. But in hindsight, everyone can see 2020.
And Mike, how about for yourself and Illumina?
Yeah, Rick, I want to look at a different side of this, and that's the fact that, like we're sitting here, we're communicating, I'm sitting in a chair on a camera, and I'm far more comfortable than I would have been, say, a year ago. And I think every one of us on this call feel the same way. We are far more comfortable communicating remotely. We are far more used to it. And I'm not going to try and say that we're going to finish the travel business, but we can certainly better differentiate between where face-to-face makes a difference and where it doesn't. And if I was to go back 18 months, I would have tried to work with psychologists, sociologists, and say, how can we measure the effectiveness of our remote travel over the next 18 months? And we've talked for decades about this term, the ROI of travel. And I know Andy loves that phrase, the ROI of travel, but we really don't have that many indicators that say this is the ROI of travel. And I think the past year we can really get that. We can say, is this more effective meeting in person? Is it more effective? We can balance the time of it. In the future, are we still going to travel 2 days across the globe for a 2-hour meeting? Maybe this year has taught us not to, but what about this year that is tangible? Can we say, yes, that taught me not to take that travel. That taught me that this trip can be handled remotely. That taught me that this engagement can be handled remotely. So I think I would like to see the past 18 months, if I was to do it again, as saying, let's reevaluate what travel is. It's a form of engagement in most cases. How can we measure that engagement? When do we say that engagement must be in person versus that engagement can be handled through other areas? And that's what I would have loved to have done 18 months ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, Mike. And so that type of discussion, the ROI of travel, when to travel, when not to travel, what metrics are involved, is that something that you're actively talking with your senior leadership about now? Have those discussions already started, maybe in late 2020, or is that something that you're kind of ramping up to?
Yes, no, it's not something I'm ramping up to. It's something I brought up even a year ago with I was part of a team called the New Normal team. We were looking at, what's it going to be like? Are we going to be sort of all working remotely, a year from now? We didn't know. And what I was trying to get across is that, is there a way, first of all, to reinforce corporate culture in a remote environment? We're used to a very physical environment for our corporate culture, but how can we translate that to the remote environment? And how can we ensure that we still feel the same sense of loyalty, the sense of cohesion with our companies in that remote environment? If we can take that and then translate that into a sort of a sort of applying remote in other situations with customers, then I think we can never get rid of travel. We can certainly do a better job of saying travel works here, travel doesn't work here. And I think so, yeah, we started those discussions a year ago, and I'm really pushing, and I'm trying to get our CSR department really involved in this. And certainly I've worked with our leaders in HR in trying to create a sort of a team that focuses on remote corporate culture. I just think that's essential to the lessons that we take out of this.
Yeah, very, very good point. And Robert, totally different industry, right, than Mike. What are your feelings on what Mike shared? Or are you kind of in the same swim lane in terms of thought process?
A little bit. I think, in a law firm, it's a little bit different because you can, there is a lot of, face-to-face, one-on-one interaction that's required because they're, working either, client-facing or court-facing. So it's a different, sort of industry. But as far as the work culture, I think even in the, in the TMC environment, and especially on the travel management side, we've been used to working in a hybrid remote, sort of environment for a number of years. So when we moved, our businesses and our, employees to a remote, infrastructure, it was actually not a complicated process because there had been some, comfort level to that. I do think that the advent, not the advent of it, but the broader implementation of, video calls and video conferencing for, one-on-one FaceTime has really elevated sort of the communications between not only, with our suppliers and our, partners, but also, internally, with the corporate culture that exists, in every company. I do notice that on our supplier side, it's definitely enhanced, both our client relationships, but also our supplier relationships, being able to, have more efficient and effective and streamlined communications that, 5 years ago, we might have done that, through a trip or traveling, whereas now we can sort of, streamline and use our time more efficiently and actually, accomplish more using some of the technology that we have access to. I think that that's going to be, an evaluation process based on what your particular client does or the client group, and how much travel is going to be related or necessary, for their end product or their work product that they need.
Mm-hmm. Now, you all three mentioned in one way or another vendor relationships, your client relationships, and they all, to a degree, involve data, right? Disparate data, internal corporate data, external vendor data. And obviously, all of you operate in a global environment. Andy consults in a global environment, and we all know there's a lot of disparate data that needs to be brought together effectively. And when a company like Grasp, my company, engages with a typical corporation or travel management company, we look to obviously solve their disparate data issues through consolidation, and it's typically TMC or agency back office, it's credit card, it's expense, GDS, meetings management. We're starting to look at telephony, more of a virtual environment. Is there one of those data sources that I didn't mention that you feel either in the lane that your company represents, or just what you're seeing from your internal constituents, that a company like ours will need to take a look at? And maybe it's passport verification, maybe it's something more around TSA, but I'd just be interested, in kind of that non-traditional data source that you're starting to see maybe more prevalent for your organization or for the travel industry. And Mike, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. So Rick, one thing in terms of one piece of data that we bring in on a very frequent basis, twice a week, is, going back to this thing, we bring in the percentage of ICU beds in a city or a state that are full. Mm-hmm. And I expect, this is just me, this is not my company, I expect to see this pandemic kind of being like a game of whack-a-mole for the next few years. It'll go up, it'll go down. We have to keep beating it somewhere. And we will have to keep that indicator on for a long time, because we're going to suddenly see, sort of a new variant come in the city, a country, whatever it is. And we're going to have to know what the availability is of ICU beds, and possibly say, we don't want to send somebody in there, they're fully vaccinated, they're not going to get sick from COVID, but if they have an accident, we're going to have to medevac them because there's no ICU beds to take care of them. So that's one thing I see, is being able to get a better grasp, not just of the risk in terms of security, but risk in terms of health of sending somebody somewhere. Second thing is one piece of information that we've always collected and it's been critical in the last year, and that's trip purpose. We manage it through our current Grasp feed. And in the past, if a manager was going to approve a trip, they wanted to know where, how much. Now, if a manager is approving a trip, they want to know why. And so the trip purpose is really a critical part of that. Is this trip essential? Is it business critical? And so not only are we really looking at those reports, I'm working with our finance team to better define trip purpose going forward, so we can be more surgical about what we say is an essential, a business critical, or just a nice to have trip. So that's the sort of two pieces of data that I would like to, my favorite ones.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. How about what you're saying? I think you're on mute, Andy. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I was trying to avoid the background noise. The puppy was making noise. Sorry. Two things that come to mind, and I don't do any commercials or even close for our company, but I might do one for Grasp. One is we recently had a client implemented, and Grasp is part of the process. And I saw an email today that came from the TMC that said, after chatting with Grasp, there's a few things that have to be tweaked. What they didn't say is they had to be tweaked by the TMC. So bringing in a third party provides not only validation, but enhanced data integrity, because I know the many things that you folks do. And one example that comes to mind is if a traveler makes a booking for round-trip air, the ticket is issued, and then a day later goes into the tool or calls the agency, books their hotel. Unless the agency invoices that that hotel data doesn't go anywhere unless Grasp is capturing it. So I would say a renewed focus on the hotel piece because of the flaws in the way we report it. And then the other one is I'm going to bring up an acronym that doesn't come out too often called RUT, R-U-T. It's Reimbursed Unmanaged Travel. It's that upwards of 50% of the spend on hotel that doesn't go through the TMC, doesn't go through the OBT, but it's in the expense system. But if there's an incident in Lyon, France, you may only be able to track 75% of your travelers in Lyon, having just left Lyon or about to go to Lyon. So it's really getting that 360 on 100% of the spend. So I would focus on getting better credit card data early, especially if it's not the approved payment. It's the only way you're going to find them.
Interesting. And Robert, how about for yourself?
Yeah, I mean the leakage is a major issue. A combination of leakage and visibility into a duty of care program. I think that COVID was a real eye opener for a combination of HR, finance, C-suite to be able to know and understand where their employees and partners, where they're at in this process. That's one thing that we're focused on as far as and by centralizing travel through multiple TMCs, better credit card data, reimbursement programs, and being able to parse information out of these various systems. The one other data element that just came up in the past couple of weeks for us, not only looking at travel today, but also down in the future, is better data coming from hotels, because we're finding, and we've run into a number of situations where hotels are starting to mandate vaccines for guests that are checking in. It's having visibility and accessibility into those systems to be able to see which properties require that before a guest arrives, type of situation. And I think that's going to come down, a combination of the GDSs and the TMCs to figure out a way of making that more visible to through the online booking tools or through the agents that are booking travel, or the companies that are contracting, with the hotels. That's a really complex sort of issue, whether or not someone can travel if there's going to be vaccine mandates. Like going into New York, there's a requirement to be able to go into a restaurant or a hotel or a bar, do anything in a social environment. But when you have a large, group of people traveling into that particular market, being able to be in compliance with your HR and your benefits programs, as well as your health and safety and duty of care programs, it's going to be a real juggler for quite a while for people.
The one thing that I'm clearly hearing from all three of you is there's been a lot of thought. There's proactive measures that are being taken, and even planning for the future. What 2 years, 3 years might look like, and I think from a company like Grasp to those on the call and even beyond, that many of the companies that we're talking to are kind of still taking a wait and see attitude in many ways, and they're not companies that necessarily work with us directly, but companies that maybe with other folks in the industry, prospects of ours, and they're kind of taking a wait and see and waiting for travel to return a little bit more substantially. And our message is don't wait. It is going to come back. It may be different. It may be different for a little while, but data is going to be so essential to be able to leverage the data, as the three of you have spoken about, for agility, to be able to quickly move in one direction to another. And if you don't have your disparate data contained, if you don't have the duty of care that you're going to need, that your HR is going to need, that your C-level is going to need, it's going to be very difficult to ramp that up very, very quickly. So our message as a supplier to the industry is certainly don't wait. If you have interest in this type of consultancy like Andy, or the technology that a company like Grasp can offer, please get in touch with us sooner rather than later. And so as we approach about 10 minutes left on our time, I just wanted to wrap with one final question. I think, Andy, you may have touched on it a little bit ago, but just for all three of you, the kind of the dream trip. I think, Andy, you mentioned safari in Africa, but you know, when we are all able to travel again to anywhere in the world or space, if you want to go in that direction, where would it be? What is the bucket list item that you're going to actually take advantage of? So, Robert, let's start with you.
Bucket trip? Actually, to get to go back to Asia would be sort of like on my bucket list right now. It's you know, it was on the horizon just prior to the pandemic, so I would like to continue on that path of, you know, exploring, you know, more of Asia and Southeast Asia.
And how about Mike?
So Rick, I'm going to go off planes and I'm going to go into the car and do a road trip to Colorado and hike part of the Colorado Trail. And part of that's to do with some of these trails closed down, some of the parts closed down at the beginning. They're open again now, but on a limited basis. I really want to get back into that, out of my comfort zone, I guess. Yeah.
And Andy, still safari, or is there another bucket list item for you?
Well, that definitely has always been on our bucket list. If I had to pick a second one for pleasure vacation, I would say back on a small ship cruise through the Mediterranean. We did one a few years back. It was 50 cabins, 100 guests, and 50 staff.
Wow. And
because it was a small ship, it could actually dock in small ports. We never had to use a tender. So in my dream world, no more tender, no more coach.
There you go. Well, those are three great locations. For me, it would be back to Italy and the hill towns of kind of the central and southern part of Italy for me and my wife. So hopefully we'll be able to get there soon. But I thank all three of you. Great conversation, great insight, certainly great takeaways for me in the industry, and hopefully those on the call as well. So we just have a few minutes before the top of the hour. Peter, I'm going to bring you in if I could. Are there questions coming in for the panelists, for myself? What do you see?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, we have some questions here. Let's see. All right, so this first one's for Andy Menkes. Where do you see meetings going in the next 4 to 6 months if the new Delta variant is controlled?
Well, I can relate to that in, I think I may have said it before. I attended an in-person meeting in Vegas that had 800 meeting planners in person. Mm-hmm. Assuming the Delta variant is controlled, I do see a reduction in the number of approved attendances at big meetings unless there can be a proven ROI. Big conferences, big events. What I think will still continue are for the life sciences companies that do lots of meetings for good reasons and revenue production. They'll still be there. So revenue producing events, I think, will continue by and large, but expense events will need to justify the ROI to send someone back to a conference of 5,000 people where you were just there 2 years ago. What's different about it? What's the ROI? To Mike's point, what's the business purpose?
Okay, we actually have one more for you, Andy. Do your clients require that you show evidence of vaccination before they meet with you?
It hasn't come up yet because in a year and a half, we have only had one in-person meeting. It was a TMC Best and Finals. It went very well. If they required it, I don't have a problem. I keep that Vax card with me whenever I travel. It's in my backpack. So if they ask for proof, each of our team would show it, but it hasn't come up yet.
Thank you very much, Andy. This one's sort of just for the floor. other than back office, credit card, and maybe GDS, what do you guys recommend to your clients?
Yeah, I think, Peter, in a way, we've all three gentlemen have really answered that in terms of, really seeing where the industry is, where the temperature is around virtual meetings. Like we're communicating to all of you today. I think from our perspective, in over 100 countries and all of the clients that we represent, certainly meetings data will continue to be prevalent. GDS data will continue to be prevalent, but it really is bringing all of these disparate data sources together into what we call, and it's not just our term, but industry term, a true cost of trip or total cost of trip. From a duty of care perspective, from a compliance leakage perspective, that's going to be more and more critical, we believe, to companies like Mike's, to companies like Robert's, to helping Andy, consult with his clients. And I think too, from a GRASP perspective, we're taking a look at passport verification. How do you bring in that data? The beds, Mike, as you mentioned, how many beds in hospitals are empty, how many are full, and it really kind of leads to that comprehensive duty of care perspective. So we are at the top of the hour, and really want to thank all of you, Andy, Mike, Robert. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, and we thank all of you for joining virtually. And again, reach out if you'd like a copy of the recording. If you have any questions for any of us, then we'll put you in touch with the right individuals. But on behalf of my colleagues at GRASP, we thank you all for your time, and we'll see you on a future webinar series. So wish you safe travels and good rest of the week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rick.
Thanks, Rick.
Thanks all. Thank you.